The reason why super zooms, generally speaking, aren't lauded is they have to be jack of all trades. They have to be decent enough wide angle shooters, decent enough telephoto shooters, they need to have fast enough autofocus, you need to stabilize that lens as well ideally if you have that longer focal length. And it's hard to balance all those different things because if you want a convenient super zoom, you don't want it to weigh 3 or 4 kilograms either. And that's why this Nikon 24 to 200mm Z lens is really interesting to me. It's the lightest super zoom in the mirrorless space at the moment, from what I can tell. Definitely full frame. It weighs 570 grams, which is significantly lighter than Canon's option. But it's still able to do quite a lot. You have a minimum aperture of f4 at 24mm. At 85mm, that changes to 6.3. So this is a variable aperture lens. What that means is as you zoom out, the effective aperture of that lens gets smaller, so therefore you let less light in. So 6.3 means, in theory, this is going to be less good at nighttime photography. However, if you're using this with a full frame Nikon camera like the Z6, the Z7, the Z8 or the Z9, chances are that you have in-body image stabilisation. Well, you definitely do. But this lens also has in-lens stabilisation, so vibration reduction as Nikon call it. And those two technologies can work together. And as long as your subject is static, you can get a sharp image down to 1/6 of a second. Maybe even less if you can hold your camera steadier than me. Now, that's really versatile. It means that you're actually able to take great photographs in darker situations without having to worry as much of that higher aperture at the longer end of the lens. Because it only weighs 570 grams, you're also more likely to take it with you. As I always have said, photography equipment is only any good if you can actually take it with you. And I think with mobile phones having gotten as good as they are, a lot of people need a reason to bring a camera with them. And this kind of lens that makes a very light combination with some of the smaller bodies means you actually get a lot of versatility without having to lug around too much equipment. In terms of other specs, this lens has 19 elements in it and 15 groups, of which there's 2 of Nikon's extra low dispersion ED elements. You also have 1 aspherical ED element. You have 2 more aspherical elements. It makes use of Nikon's Arneo coating to reduce ghosting. So when you shoot into a bright object, when you see the reflections within the lens. And it also has a fluorine coated front lens, or fluoride coated front lens. That's really useful to help dust and moisture not stick to the front of the lens, makes cleaning it and keeping it clean much easier too. In terms of controls, Nikon has really stripped this one down. And given the brief of making a lens that can do many things very well, that's fair enough. I think it also helps with keeping the weight down. The one thing they have given us is a lock button, which locks this lens at 24mm and ensures that when it's in your bag, it's not going to extend and potentially get damaged. It's a good feature. Personally, I would prefer to have an autofocus manual switch on the side, or indeed a vibration reduction switch. However, Nikon hasn't given us a VR switch on any of their lenses, and I don't think they're going to start now. And we also don't get the autofocus manual switch here either. It's one of those things. This does have manual override on the rear ring, but it is, as all Nikon's autofocus Z lenses are, a fly-by-wire design, which does still take me a little bit of getting used to, because depending on how fast you spin it, changes how much of the focus it changes, how quickly. So it can be a little bit fiddly, but it is totally usable. The rear ring seems to be plastic. Some of the lenses have metal ones, and then the front ring is a nice rubber coated grip on it, which is nice and easy to use. You also get included the HB93 lens hood. I would always advise you to leave the lens hood on this lens at all times. It will really help if you walk into an object or accidentally bash the camera against something, about stopping to damage the front element. You can always reverse it and lock it in place for storage when you're traveling or have the camera in a bag. Other things about this lens that impressed me were the fact that we have a metal lens mount. Yes, it's a longer lens, so perhaps they didn't have a choice, but on some of Nikon's cheaper lenses for the Z mount, we have seen plastic mounts, so I'm pleased that we have a metal mount here. And all of this is going to cost you about 800 British pounds, 800 US dollars, or indeed currently around 700 pounds, 720 I believe it's on the Nikon website for at the moment. So it can be surprisingly affordable. So I guess the question you're asking is, how good is it really? Is it sharp enough? Is it clear enough? And that's the thing. That's what has kind of blown me away with this. The actual image quality that you get from this 24-200 super zoom is really, really good. I mean, you've got some examples that you can look at throughout this video, but to me at least, the sharpness of the images is spot on. It's not quite to the level of the S lenses, but it's more than sharp enough. It's sharper than the majority of lenses I've had pre-Z mount. Its color rendition is very nice. The contrast is excellent. It really doesn't suffer a huge amount from ghosting when you have a point light source in the image. You don't see a huge amount of ghosting in it. It has a 7-bladed aperture, which means you have relatively smooth backgrounds on it. It looks very pleasant. I wouldn't quite go as far to say you get heavy bokeh from this lens with it being f4 to f6.3, but you can, in some situations at 200mm, create a nice blurred background, which looks good. And overall, it really can do everything. And given the weight of this lens, I actually really enjoy using it. If I take the 24-70 here and mount this lens on my Z6 II, this is a very stable, hand-holdable platform at 200mm that you don't really have any other options for on the Z mount currently. If you want a 200mm full frame lens, this is pretty much your main choice if you want to be able to handhold it with a single hand and even take photos whilst handholding it with one hand. Would I recommend it? Probably not. Ideally, you do want to be holding it with two hands to give yourself the most stable platform, but you absolutely can do it, and having that option is always a nice thing. Other things I like about the lens is it is moisture and dust resistant. It's not quite as moisture and dust resistant as the S line of lenses that Nikon makes for Z mount, but it's more than enough. I've taken it on various trips, various holidays, and it's worked really, really well. I've just used it for general photography out and about because it's actually quite nice and simple to use. And I've even shot a whole lot of B-roll with it as well, because at the end of the day, it was on my camera. I didn't really want to change. I didn't think it'd be a problem, and it wasn't. The autofocus is surprisingly crisp. It's not the quickest, again, but it is quicker than all the other super zooms that I've used in the past. I had a terrible experience with Nikon's 28-300mm lens, really disliked that, and I absolutely hated the Nikon 18-200 VR1, the initial version of that lens when it launched for the DX mount series DSLRs. But this one here, I'm very, very, very positively impressed by it. So should you run out and buy one? Well, to be honest, if you need a one-stop shop for all your photography needs whilst you're traveling, or just don't want to build up a huge collection of lenses, I'd really recommend it. Maybe you could supplement it with one of the initial fixed focal length lenses. So for instance, the 35, 50 or 85mm 1.8, depending on which focal length you like most. And again, you don't need to make that decision now if you're just getting into the Nikon Z mount. Perhaps you want to take a whole load of photos with this lens for a few months, have a look at the focal lengths in something like Lightroom, see what you're using. If you happen to take photos at 35mm, get the 35 1.8. If you're taking more photos at 50, get the 50 1.8, and so on. You do have a fair bit of flexibility, and then you can have that ultra crisp, razor sharp contrast that you can get from those S-line lenses at a more affordable budget without having to go out and buy the 24-70 2.8 and the 70-200 2.8. Of course, there are a lot more options in terms of the Z mount at the moment. You could go for the 24-70 F4S. You could get the 24-120 F4S. Both of those fixed apertures, so you're guaranteed f4 at the maximum focal length that they're capable of. But at the end of the day, they don't offer the same level of flexibility that this lens does. I'd say the closest you can get to this is having the 16-50 and 50-250mm DX lenses, but for that you'd have to have the Z30 or Z50, as you really wouldn't be taking full benefit of the full frame sensor in the FX cameras that Nikon sells. The only real alternative to this is probably the 18 to 140mm that's sold for Nikon's DX size Z mount cameras, so for instance the Z30, Z50 and ZFC. However, I take that with a caveat in terms of those are very different cameras, and if you're looking at full frame, that's a different option. I also haven't tested the 18 to 140 yet. It is on my list, so hopefully we'll have a review of that coming soon. This all being said, I really like the 24 to 200. I don't think I've drank the Kool-Aid on this one. I do think it's as good as it looks. And when I was looking to buy it, I did also read the reviews at the time, and they were all quite impressed by it. Though I did note that some people said there seemed to be some variance from lens to lens. I don't know if that's still the case. Perhaps I've just got a particularly good one. But anecdotally, it does seem most people are really happy with it. So I would say it's worth a shot. Given the pricing at the moment of around £700, certainly worth considering. On eBay, you should be able to get one for about £500, £550, maybe £600. So if you want to save a little bit more money if you're unsure about the purchase, worth having a look there. But yes, to me, the Nikon 24 to 200 f4-6.3 is a surprisingly capable super zoom that is unlikely to be a disappointment like some of the previous versions of this kind of lens. It is actually usable day to day and will give you nice results. So hopefully you found this review useful. If you did, give the video a thumbs up. If you have any questions about the lens, pop them in the comment section below. I'm always happy to help as much as I can. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, as that really does help me out. Thank you very much for watching. I hope I see you again next time. Goodbye.